Welcome to this explainer, from scattered to a great army. Have you ever looked at a massive undertaking or, maybe just your own life goals and felt incredibly small? Like your efforts are completely scattered, totally insignificant, and barely making a dent? Well, today we're exploring a fascinating historical and theological narrative from our source material that hits the nail right on the head when it comes to this exact feeling. We're going to look at how small, isolated, and seemingly defeated beginnings can actually gradually transform into a massive, unified force.
To really wrap our heads around this concept, our source text kicks things off with an incredible historical hook. It's the story of the Moravian Brethren. Now, back in the early 18th century, these followers of the Bohemian reformer Jan Hus were absolutely shattered. They had lived through the sheer brutality of the 30 Years' War and faced some truly severe religious persecution. Their churches were quite literally destroyed. For nearly a century, 100 years, they survived with no nation, no church buildings, just living as scattered refugees, desperately trying to hold on to their faith in secret. Just try to imagine the utter despair of going 100 years without a true community.
Okay, let's dive into this. Fast forward to 1727. A few of these scattered refugee families finally managed to cross the border seeking asylum, and a young count named Zinzendorf took pity on them. He offered them a small, pretty unassuming hill on his estate. Right there, they established a tiny, seemingly insignificant village called Herrnhut, which actually translates to the Lord's Watch. Now, at first it was nothing, just a handful of destitute families with literally nothing to their name.
But then, the Moravian miracle happened. News of this safe haven slowly spread, right? Scattered believers from Bohemia and other persecuted lands began arriving. But here's the thing, they didn't all show up at once. They came day by day. And as this community grew, they experienced this profound spiritual awakening and made a radical commitment, a 24/7 continuous prayer relay. And here is the truly staggering part of the history, that prayer fire burned without a single interruption for over 100 years. No way, right? But it's true. This single tiny village of refugees sparked the modern Protestant missions movement. They sent out a literal army of missionaries that changed the world, even deeply influencing major historical figures like John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. So they went from scattered refugees to a global movement.
Section 1. Dilemma of the Returned Community.
So our source material takes this idea of a scattered people gathering to form a powerful force, and it applies it to a much larger macro-biblical context. The book of 1 Chronicles addresses what we call a return community. These were Israelites who had just returned from 70 long years of Babylonian exile, only to find their once magnificent temple totally in ruins. Understandably, they felt incredibly small and weak, because they were mostly made up of just a few tribes from the south, Judah, Benjamin, and some Levites. A massive question hung heavily over them. What exactly happened to the 10 northern tribes of Israel after the kingdom originally split following King Solomon's reign? Were they just gone forever? Could they ever truly be a whole nation again?
To answer that, we really have to compare the imperial policies of the nations that actually conquered them. Assyria conquered the north in 722 BC, and honestly, their policy was intentionally destructive. It was all about forced relocation and mandatory intermarriage. The intended result? The complete loss of cultural and national identity. Because of this, those northern tribes effectively vanished into history. Babylon, on the other hand, conquered the south about 150 years later in 587 BC, but they utilized a far more lenient policy without all that forced assimilation. And this is exactly what allowed the southern tribes to preserve their identity and eventually make their way back home after 70 years.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what that returned community nostalgically longed for, the glory days of the unified kingdom under Saul and David. The memory of that vast, totally unified territory made the disappearance of those 10 northern tribes incredibly painful for the survivors in Jerusalem. How could they ever rebuild a great, unified nation when more than half of their historical brothers were completely lost to history?
Section 2. David's Crisis and Reversal.
To find hope in this seemingly impossible situation, the text zooms into 1 Chronicles chapter 12, focusing on how King David actually built that legendary unified kingdom in the very first place. And here is the secret. It wasn't when he was just sitting comfortably on a throne. Not at all. It started at his absolute lowest point, the disaster at Ziklag. David, who was hiding out from his rival King Saul, tried to join the Philistine army but was flat out rejected and sent packing by their commanders. He trudged all the way back to his base camp at Ziklag, only to find it completely burned and raided by Amalekites, with all the women and children kidnapped. The grief was so intense that his own loyal men, in their total despair, actually threatened to stone him to death. Talk about a complete mutiny and total isolation. But then, the text reveals a dramatic reversal.
Right at this darkest, most isolating moment of David's entire life, powerful military commanders from the northern tribe of Manasseh unexpectedly arrive. Warriors like Adnah, Jozabed, Jadiel, and others just show up out of nowhere. Think about it. When David had absolutely nothing to offer them, no money, no status, nothing, these fierce warriors from the north step in to help him fight the raiders.
The narrative frames this entire sequence of events as a providential escape. Because, if you really look at it, David's humiliating rejection by the Philistines was actually a massive blessing in disguise. It kept him from fighting alongside enemies against his own people and King Saul. This meant he totally avoided any blame for Saul's death on Mount Gilboa, which eventually paved the way for him to be accepted as the true king later on. Furthermore, being sent away freed up his army just in time to chase down the Amalekites and rescue their kidnapped families, especially with the help of these newly arrived northern commanders.
Section 3. The Daily Gathering Miracle.
This brings us right to the theological climax of the source text. How was this great unified army of Israel actually built? Because the text makes it crystal clear it wasn't by David violently conquering the northern tribes by force, and it certainly didn't happen overnight with the snap of a finger. The answer is beautifully captured in 1 Chronicles 12:22. The quote reads, "At that time men came to David day by day to help him, until there was a great army, like an army of God." Notice the phrasing here. This grand unified kingdom that the returned community so desperately missed, it was originally built through a voluntary, gradual assembly of people.
So the crucial point is the central phrase, day by day. In the original text, this concept is absolutely front and center. It emphasizes that this wasn't a sudden, magical manifestation of a massive, fully equipped army. One person came, the next day, 2 more came. The source argues that God's plan unfolds one person, one day at a time. It requires a lot of patience and deep trust in the gradual gathering of strength. It's like a giant puzzle slowly coming together piece by piece.
Let's move to and see how this builds into the New Testament, because the source beautifully draws a direct line from this Old Testament principle to the early church. In 1 Chronicles, men came to David day by day. Fast forward a few centuries to the early Christian church in Acts chapter 2, and we see the exact same pattern at work. The Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. The text argues that this is fundamentally how the divine operates, gathering scattered, seemingly broken people day by day to build something entirely unstoppable.
Section 4. Application for us today.
So, what does this all mean for us? How does this ancient historical and biblical narrative apply to us right now? While our source specifically addressed a local congregation at Bethel Church, these overarching principles are highly applicable to anyone trying to build something meaningful today. We can see a very clear modern parallel outlined here. Just like that returned community staring at ruined walls, we often feel incredibly small and inadequate in our own endeavors. We face overwhelming odds and moments of total despair, much like David staring at the ashes of Ziklag. But the core takeaway from this explainer is to trust the gradual process, rather than our own anxious calculations. It's about faithfully staying at your post and warmly welcoming the help, the people, and the resources that arrive day by day, rather than burning yourself out trying to force massive, immediate growth all by yourself.
Which leaves us with this final provocative question to consider as we wrap up today. As you look at the massive challenges or goals in front of you, are you frantically trying to build your strength all alone, forcing outcomes through sheer willpower? Or are you trusting the process, remaining open and ready to welcome the vital help that comes your way day by day? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep trusting that process, and I'll catch you next time.